Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. As a music historian, I spend a lot of time looking at charts. But today we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most thoroughly documented eras in music history to look at something, well, entirely different. We aren't just here to talk about the sheer blinding success of the biggest band of the 1960s. Instead, we're actually going to look right past them, straight into the shadows. We're uncovering the hidden human stories, the staggering rivalries, and the unbelievable cultural milestones that were completely obscured by the blinding light of Beatlemania.
So let's kick things off with a bit of a brain teaser. What do Bob Dylan, one of the most legendary songwriters of all time, a Belgian Dominican nun, and a totally obscure bankrupt session drummer all have in common? I mean, on paper, their lives and careers literally could not have been more different, right? But history tied them together with one very bizarre, inescapable fate.
The answer, they were all caught in the massive, inescapable gravitational pull of the Beatles. Today, we're mapping out this wild ripple effect. We're going to examine the legendary and, in some cases, truly tragic figures who were swept up, blocked, or completely swallowed whole by the chart-topping tsunami of John, Paul, George, and Ringo.
Part 1. The Beatlemania chart juggernaut. Let's get into it.
All right, so to really grasp the impact the Fab Four had on everyone else, we got to look at the numbers. 20. That is the all-time record the Beatles hold for the most Billboard Hot 100 #1 songs in U.S. chart history. 20. No other artist has ever matched this peak. And you got to remember, back then, charts were driven entirely by physical record sales and radio play. It's not like today's modern streaming era where digital consumption metrics heavily dictate the charts. Reaching this level of chart saturation back in the 60s was basically impossible.
And their momentum in their breakout year, absolutely staggering. In 1964 alone, they spent a total of 18 weeks at the top of the Hot 100, securing 6 different #1 singles in just a 12-month span. To put that into perspective for you, that is more than twice the time at #1 achieved by any other act that entire year.
And this really shows you just how impenetrable they were. By April 1964, they had achieved the totally unprecedented feat of holding the entire top 5 on the Hot 100 simultaneously. The entire top 5. They were so dominant, they actually became their own chart rivals. Their hit Can't Buy Me Love sat at #1, permanently blocking their own track Twist and Shout from reaching the top spot. What's wild is that initially, US labels like Capitol Records actually passed on them, thinking they wouldn't suit the American market. But once rogue radio DJs forced their hand by aggressively playing imported tracks, those same labels weaponized that radio play to trigger a full-blown British invasion that changed the music business forever.
Moving right along to Part 2, the singing nun anomaly.
So, right before the Beatles completely took over, the charts were actually ruled by someone you would never expect. It's a story that perfectly captures how wildly the musical landscape was about to shift. Meet Jean-Paul Deckers, better known as Sourire, or Sister Smile. Now, as a musician historian looking at Billboard's evolution, which has gone through many names, from the best-selling popular record albums in 1945 to what we now call the Billboard 200, her achievement is monumental. Deckers was a Belgian Dominican nun who in 1963 became the very first solo female of the Billboard 200 era to hit #1 simultaneously on both the single and album charts, and she did it with her French acoustic track Dominique. In an era heavily dominated by male acts, this bespectacled vocalist fundamentally altered the landscape for non-English chart hits.
But here's where the Beatles' arrival marks a really dark turning point. Deckers' massive initial victory, holding that #1 spot for 10 weeks and selling millions, was abruptly dethroned in February 1964 by the album Meet the Beatles. And from there, her life took a tragic arc. Struggling with sudden fame, she eventually left the convent, but because she had given all her earnings straight to the church without a proper paper trail, the tax authorities relentlessly pursued her. Destitute and struggling with addiction, this former global phenomenon tragically took her own life in 1985.
Part 3. The Beatle Who Vanished.
Now, while the singing nun's career faded right as the Beatles arrived, there was one incredibly obscure musician who actually got to ride their wave at its absolute dizzying peak. Take a close look at the man on the far right. No, that isn't Ringo Starr. That is Jimmy Nicol. Nicol was a seasoned session drummer who, in 1964, was catapulted into the band to temporarily replace a hospitalized Ringo. He literally stepped into the biggest cultural phenomenon on Earth for exactly 13 days.
I mean, talk about a roller coaster timeline. Nicol goes from playing local London coffee bars to performing massive 10-song set lists as a literal Beatle, receiving over 5,000 fan letters in Australia. But the fall was breathtakingly fast. Just a year later, in 1965, he was bankrupt, divorced, and completely forgotten by the British media. He fled England to find work elsewhere, eventually vanishing from the music world entirely. He became so obscure that by 1988, rumors were actually circulating that he had died at age 49, completely detached from the 13 days he spent as a rock deity.
All right, part 4, stuck at number 2. So here is the really crucial point. Beatlemania didn't just eclipse people. It permanently blocked some of the greatest songs in history from ever reaching the top of the charts. Exactly 14 songs, 14, earned the incredibly frustrating and dubious distinction of peaking at number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 purely because they couldn't knock a Beatles track out of the number 1 spot.
Just look at these heavyweights. These aren't just hit songs, they are massive cultural milestones. Bob Dylan's revolutionary 6-minute opus Like a Rolling Stone stopped dead in its tracks by Help. The Beach Boys' Barbara Ann couldn't beat We Can Work It Out. Leslie Gore's powerful 1964 feminist anthem, You Don't Own Me, was halted by I Wanna Hold Your Hand. It is so fascinating how a polished pop track took the number 1 spot, while the gritty, revolutionary messages of the number 2 hits often cemented a deeper, longer-lasting cultural legacy. And this ripple effect crossed genres too. Labels were heavily pushing the new blue-eyed soul sound onto pop radio, but even incredible tracks like Roy Head's funky Treat Her Right were locked at number 2 behind the Beatles' Yesterday.
But the biggest blocker of them all, that was Hey Jude. It dominated the charts so thoroughly that it held 3 entirely separate tracks at number 2. We're talking the theatrical rock track Fire, the soulful country crossover Little Green Apples, and Mary Hopkins' Those Were the Days. Which is uniquely ironic because Hopkins' song was actually produced by Paul McCartney himself and released on the Beatles' very own Apple Records. Talk about friendly fire.
And finally, part 5, unlikely rivals and conquerors.
But, as this explainer reveals, the Beatles weren't totally invincible. Despite their legendary dominance, they did have a few conquerors who managed to break through the mania. And there's a wonderful irony in the fact that the Beatles themselves occasionally had to taste the bitterness of sitting at number 2. It was none other than jazz legend Louis Armstrong who ended the Beatles' initial 14-week reign at the top in 1964 with Hello Dolly. And while male rock bands dominated pop, they were constantly fighting off the unstoppable momentum of Motown. It was often the heavily label-orchestrated, massive cross-genre appeal of female-led Motown acts like the Supremes that possessed the firepower to push the Beatles down, famously blocking Yellow Submarine from hitting number 1 with You Can't Hurry Love. Ultimately, Motown giants like the Supremes and the Jackson 5 were responsible for displacing a total of 5 Beatles number 1 hits.
Take a second to look at this absolutely wild lyric from Arthur Brown's theatrical rock track, Fire, one of the songs blocked by Hey Jude, by the way. This track was actually championed to radio stations by Jimi Hendrix himself. It just proves how immense the Beatles were. Even the absolute craziest, most high-voltage theatrical energy of the late 60s rock scene was, at the end of the day, just a runner-up to Beatlemania. Which leads us to a really fascinating final thought to wrap up our explainer today. When we look back at legendary, culture-shifting tracks like Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone or Leslie Gore's You Don't Own Me, we really have to ask, did these iconic number 2 hits ultimately leave a larger, more revolutionary musical legacy than the catchy Beatles pop songs that kept them out of the top spot? Definitely something to chew on the next time you look at the charts. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep exploring, and I'll catch you next time.